Good evening and welcome. Before we begin our program, we'd like to share some information for how you may turn on Zoom's closed captioning. To access closed captioning on Zoom, please click on the live transcription button on the lower right-hand side on the menu bar of your Zoom screen. You may also watch online at brooklineinteractive.org/live or tune into Comcast RCN Channel 3, where closed captioning will also be available. Again, welcome everyone, and thank you all for being with us tonight. My name is Amy Takanami. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I identify racially as Asian and ethnically as Japanese American, and I'll be co-facilitating tonight's forum with Kimberly Richardson, who will introduce herself shortly. We will begin our program with a land acknowledgement. As we gather here today, let us take a moment to acknowledge the history of this land we call Brookline. This is the unceded land of the Massachusetts people, whose traditions, language, and stewardship continue today through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe of Ponkapoag. Today, we are living on land that was taken by force. By 1641, the colonists in Brookline had allocated to themselves almost all land that had been inhabited by Indigenous people. Land was not the only form of theft that occurred. Lives were also stolen. Historical records state that in 1675, during King Philip's War, 7 Indigenous men were sold into slavery in the Caribbean by residents of the area we now call Brookline. The 7 men represent part of the early slave trade. Slavery in Brookline continued and grew, but soon those enslaved were African or of African descent. By 1746, enslavers claimed ownership of over half of all Brookline land. We acknowledge the theft of land, culture, and lives in the ensuing enslavement of Indigenous and African peoples that occurred here. These early policies set the stage for centuries of systemic racism. Colonists in Brookline. As we remember these atrocities, BRJE members and the larger town must commit ourselves to address the ongoing inequities that are the result of our history of colonialism and racism. Although we as individuals were not perpetrators of these atrocities, we benefit from these systems. Thus, we dedicate ourselves to addressing them today. Thank you all for participating in our land acknowledgement and for attending our 4th annual BRJE Racial Justice Candidate Forum. Brookline for Racial Justice and Equity, known as BRJE, was founded in 2016 to identify and clarify issues of racial inequity and injustice in Brookline, and to build a multiracial coalition to dismantle structural racism. Our hope for tonight's event is to provide the opportunity for all of us in Brookline to be better informed about our candidates' views on racial justice, a topic which often gets sidelined. Instead, this forum puts racial justice front and center and asks candidates to make public their commitments to racial justice policy. I want to thank Brookline Interactive Group, or BIG, for broadcasting and live streaming our forum tonight, and a special shout out to Ann Tice from BIG and Abby Erdman and Luciana Shoshnik from BRJE.
So before I introduce myself, I just want to give a huge shout out to Amy, because if it wasn't for her, none of this would be possible tonight. So thank you so much, Amy, for all of your hard work. My name is Kimberly Richardson. I use she, her, her pronouns, and I identify racially as Black. Candidates will be running on a very tight schedule tonight. This is not a debate with opportunities to rebut. You will have 2 minutes to respond to each of the questions, and you will have 2 minutes for your opening and closing statements. Our timekeeper, Ann Thies, will be displaying a countdown on her screen and will be muting respondents at the end of their time. We will put questions in the chat so candidates can refer to them so we don't have to restate them. We have randomly determined responses for each question to be fair to all candidates. We will begin our evening with questions from Mike Sandman, our candidate for Select Board. Next, we will move into questions for our 4 candidates for the school committee race: Helen Charlevsky, Valerie Frias, Stephen Ehrenberg, and Nancy Ray Gora. We are not looking for platitudes here. We want to understand how your life and professional experiences will inform your work at school committee, as a school committee member and as a member of the Select Board. And we especially want to hear your specific anti-racist policy commitments. Thank you. Thank you all again. So let's begin.
We'll begin with an opening statement from our candidate for Select Board, Mike Sandman. Mike, please include in your opening statement your pronouns and how you identify racially and ethnically.
Hi, I'm Mike Sandman. My pronouns are he and him, and I identify racially as a Caucasian. And I want to say thank you for inviting me and for offering the event. I grew up in Worcester, and I went to Worcester Public Schools. Schools in Worcester were not segregated, but housing in the city certainly was. So there was precisely one Black student in my grade, all through primary school and high school. When he got his letter for track and field at the end of senior year at the awards assembly, the coach gave him the navy blue jacket with the big white C for classical, and he said, he's a credit to his race. 400 students groaned. 60 years ago, most of us knew that was a racist remark. My grad school roommate was born in a camp for Japanese Americans who were interned in Colorado at the start of World War II. He married a fellow student who was Caucasian, and when I was leaving to go to their wedding, my own mother said I shouldn't be going to an interracial wedding. So I know that racism runs deep in America. I think most white residents of Brookline acknowledge that racism exists, but they don't see the barriers that we put in front of minorities. I see some of those barriers, but I know that I don't see them all. And sometimes I need to have them pointed out to me. So I'm happy to answer questions tonight. I may ask a few, but I also invite you to tell me tonight and in the future when I miss something. And when I say when I miss, I mean when, not if. Please understand, I can't always change things. I won't always agree with you, but I do promise to listen and to learn. So let's get started.
Thanks, Mike. Our first question for you is, how do your racial and ethnic identities influence and affect your work for racial justice? What are your blind spots and how will you be holding yourself accountable? And I'll put the question in the chat.
Yes, please. Yeah. Let me start by saying that I spent the first 25 years or so of my career in the industrial textiles and chemicals industry, and I spent a lot of time in the South, going back and forth to textile mills, and starting in the 1970s, and some other places around the world, and I saw things that I recognized right from the start were racist, and they were so obviously racist that it just wasn't possible to miss them, as far as I was concerned, at least. And I think that that set of experiences really sort of they primed me. It's more difficult, I think, for people with my experience, my age, my race, for that matter, to see the less obvious, the more subtle signs of racism. And for that reason, I'm really, I'm very determined to be as open as I possibly can be to looking and to listening. And I guess that's probably, I should stop there and say that's probably the best that I or any of my peers can do.
Thanks, Mike. Our second question for you is, Brookline's Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, or ODICR's 2022 Disparity Report found a lack of Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC representation in town government and committees. Data from the ODICR's 2020 survey found that Brookline's commissions, committees, and boards are 82% white, even though the overall town is only 64% white. What structural barriers limit citizens of color from participating in our town's government, commissions, and boards? And how will you address these barriers in your term on Selectboard? And I'll make sure to put the question in the chat as well for you.
Right. I think the same thing applies here as it applies in situations where you're trying to recruit employees into a workplace that isn't particularly diverse. It's really necessary to go out and identify people that you'd like to apply for positions. That's the way to break down barriers for people who feel like well, they wouldn't be welcome. And it's also a way to find some very, very talented people in the town who can contribute to the boards and commissions and so forth. So what I would do is try to talk to members in each of the ethnic and minority communities and ask them who they would recommend for particular jobs and volunteer jobs in the town, and see if it's possible to get them to apply. I've done that as when I was chair of the advisory committee. I did that trying to get people to volunteer for the advisory committee, and recognizing that it's the moderator who appoints the members, just the same the chair can present some people. And I found it very difficult because the committee itself took a huge amount of time. There are a lot of other positions in town, however, that don't take nearly that amount of time. And what I'm hoping is that kind of recruiting effort will be much more effective for those sorts of volunteer jobs.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. First question is, after 11 years of struggle, the town of Brookline finally settled the lawsuit with Gerald Alston. As Mr. Alston has noted, no one has been held accountable for the racism that he has endured, and nothing has changed in Brookline. How will you ensure another racist incident like the one Gerald Alston experienced does not happen again in Brookline? Please name tangible policies and practice you plan to implement to prevent future harm.
So a couple of days ago, I sat down and had coffee with Justin Robinson, who is a lieutenant in the Brookline Fire Department. And he described to me a program that the fire department had put in place, and that he was expecting would evolve into training by a group of people who are, I guess, former firefighters from Seattle on racism and barriers in the workplace. And he was really very enthusiastic about these people. And I have no idea whether they're white or African American or what they are, but he felt like they would be able to. He apparently been through their program and felt like that is something that would work in Brookline and would have staying power. And I think it's really interesting that it is the union that has put that into place. It is something that one might think the town would take a very careful look at doing the same thing in other departments if it appears to be successful. And I raised the issue with them, well, training, what does that mean? Does it work? Does it have legs? Does it really affect people's behavior in the long term? And he said it was a reasonable question. He felt that these people that were doing the training would be able to come back and do some reinforcement when necessary, and on a periodic basis, and that's the sort of program that could work. And with the 21 seconds that I have left, I'll say that I think that idea of going out and finding someone who will come back and regularly buttress the things that they're teaching and the things that they're getting people to see and understand is the best way to go. And I also want to reiterate that it's the union that has put this in place.
Thanks, Mike. Our fourth question for you is, it's been a little over a year since Brookline's task force to reimagine policing, which you sat on, shared their findings. Some of these recommendations that have yet to be realized include developing a new social services department and a community-based alternative crisis response model. What are your priorities around public safety in Brookline? And what, if anything, would you change about the police's role in promoting public safety, particularly for our BIPOC communities?
Right. So I'm a very big fan of picking up on the model from Eugene, Oregon, the CAHOOTS model. It's something that the task force endorsed. We had someone from CAHOOTS from Eugene on Zoom come and talk to us for an hour or so and describe the program. That program, the best way to implement that program is to set up a joint police health department group that will identify what sorts of social services the police are providing, what sorts of social services can be transferred over to something like Cahoots, which provides a response when somebody calls into 911 when the 911 operator thinks that that's the appropriate organization or group to send it to. And so to me, that's the number one thing to do with regard to policing. It would transfer some responsibilities, and therefore, as a practical matter, it needs to transfer some funding and some staff, some FTEs from the police department to the health department. And it's a very practical approach. It seems to me like it's the first step that we should go towards. The police department itself is feeling under, or police officers are feeling under a great deal of pressure, and from the criticism that they've received, they have tended to circle the wagons. And I think that it's important, both with Cahoots and in any other way that we can, to sit down and have a conversation with police officers, with the police union, and do that in a way that allows for some back and forth discussion, so that you can understand and I can understand what's in their minds and they can understand what's in ours.
Thank you, Mike. Our fifth question is, Brookline was the first town in the country to include a racially restrictive covenant in a property deed. And we still see and experience the impacts of our racist housing history today. What are your policies and priorities to address our housing crisis, and how will you ensure those policies and priorities benefit low-income, working class, BIPOC people, families, and communities who have been most harmed by our racist housing history?
That is probably the toughest question as a practical matter to do something about that you have mentioned, because we're living in the middle of the city of Boston, basically. You can walk from where I live, you can walk to Fenway Park. Boston is in one of the most successful metropolitan areas in the world right now. And so you have large numbers of people coming into the Boston area. They have high-paying jobs, they're professionals. That's the sectors, the biotech and technology sectors that are bringing people in. And they want good schools for their kids, and so they gravitate towards Brookline, somewhat less to Newton, to Lexington, and so forth, but especially to Brookline. And that has forced housing up, and so we are past the point of being at risk. We have actually gone to the point of having a cluster of people in low income and affordable housing, a group of people in much more expensive housing, and nobody in between. Brookline used to be a community where people with sort of average incomes, teachers, police officers and firefighters, and office workers could buy a house and live. And that's not true anymore. I think that the only way to approach that problem is to change zoning in a very significant way, along the lines of what the state is actually mandating communities to do, to set aside an area that is available for developers by right to build housing that is affordable. We don't have that now. The process of getting zoning approval for almost anything in Brookline is really an incredibly horrible gauntlet. And so the practical step is to do something with our zoning ordinance. And I realize that there are people who are proposing to do something with the zoning ordinance and who sound an awful lot like they want to continue to use it as a barrier. I think a thorough review of zoning will change that equation. It will, first of all, we have a state law that we need to conform to. And secondly, I think a broad community participation will give us a good result when it comes to zoning, a result that does indeed break down some of those barriers. And I do regret that I only have 2 minutes to answer that question. That's a much longer question.
Thanks, Mike. And that actually ends the question and answer period, but we'd like to give you an opportunity to make a final statement. Please remember to just keep your final statement to under 2 minutes. Over to you.
Well, I just want to repeat what I said. It won't take 2 minutes either. That I'm really happy to answer questions tonight, and you had some very good questions, which is exactly what I expected. But I also recognize that I'm going to miss things in the future. I've said to people who have, I've said to the chair of the Women's Commission, Rebecca Stone, if you see something that I'm missing when it comes to women's issues, please tell me. I don't want to miss it. And I'll say exactly the same thing to you. When I miss something, I want to hear about it. And I hope actually that we'll have an open line of communication. I have a link on my website, my campaign website, that lets people sign up for a 30-minute conversation or back-to-back for an hour conversation with a couple of people. I'm going to have a website with that same link on it so that it'll be accessible. People can get to set up an appointment on my calendar and it will be there and we'll talk. So please use that facility when it's there, when you have something you want to talk about. Thank you.
Mike, our candidate for Select Board, for your time and your responses. Next, we will hear from the candidates for the school committee race: Helen Charlevsky, Valerie Frias, Stephen Ehrenberg, Nancy Ray Gora. As a reminder, you will have 2 minutes to respond to each of the questions asked. You will also have 2 each of your opening and closing statements. Our timekeeper, Ann, will be displaying a countdown on her screen and will be muting respondents at the end of their time. Thank you all again for joining us. Let's begin.
We'll begin with opening statements for our candidates for school committee. The order of responses for opening statements will be Helen, Stephen, Valerie, Nancy. Please include in your opening statements your pronouns and how you identify racially and ethnically. Over to you, Helen.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Helen Charlevsky. I guess I'm she and her. Although for me, in my generation, that's sort of a harder thing to talk about. But that being said, I guess I'd like to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. I'm an immigrant to the United States. It might not be totally visible that I am, but my parents were refugees after World War II. They were Holocaust survivors. And I came here when I was 6 months old. We lived in 5 states in 1 year till my dad was able to settle down in Michigan, in Detroit, and that's where I grew up. Probably one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Everybody was in a different place. It was very unlike Brookline. You had the Black community lived in one place, the WASP community was in another place, the Polish community, everybody, and people didn't really cross over that much. I guess for me, I was the first in my family to go to college. And all of these things, I think, make up who I am. I'm a social worker by training. When I came here to Boston, I got a job as a Spanish-speaking social worker at Children's Hospital, where I worked with multi-problem Spanish families, Spanish-speaking families, mostly from Mission Hill, in the psychiatry department of Children's. And I guess, even I'm trying to think some of my experiences in growing up when I went to the University of Michigan. And I remember at the time there was a Black Action movement where we were protesting because there were more Indians from India than there were Black students at the University of Michigan. And we were trying to get it up to 10% at that time. That was the goal.
Sorry, Helen, that was your 2 minutes.
Sorry, I wasn't looking at the time. I was talking. Go ahead.
And just a reminder for candidates, if you want to see the time, please keep it on gallery view. Next up is Stephen.
Thanks, Amy. My name is Stephen Ehrenberg. I go by he, him. I have been in Brookline for about 10 years. I have 2 daughters at the Lawrence School. And like Helen, my father fled Nazis for his childhood. I'm a first-generation American. Professionally, I direct a global program called Next Engineers. It's an initiative to support historically underrepresented groups in engineering to become an engineer. That's mostly girls and youth of color, although we define it locally, mostly by secondary school, after school programming, and scholarships. I was elected to the school committee last May. I'm on the curriculum and finance subcommittees. I'm also the school committee's METCO liaison. I thought a lot about what I want to say here, and I just want to boil it down to this. I think racism and racial inequity is a serious problem across the public schools of Brookline. I think that's in evidence in a lot of ways from disparities in academic achievement as measured by the admittedly imperfect MCAS, teacher recruitment and retention, and not just Black teachers, not just Latinx teachers, but especially AAPI teachers, who are only 5% of our teaching workforce, even though AAPI students make up 20% of the workforce, as evidenced by disproportionality in our special education, disproportionality in how we discipline our students, as evidenced by the recent hate speech and hate iconography incidents at BHS, and by students' own words and language in their protests and statements, which have been abundant. I think we made a lot of progress of late. I think the fact that and I have supported the expansion of our Office of Educational Equity from 1 hardworking person to 2.5 people this coming year is a sign of progress, and also the fact that we have established a DEI and J subcommittee that I've been championing and that Val will be chairing. And I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Valerie?
Hi, I'm Valerie Frias. First of all, I want to thank Bridge for hosting us tonight, and Big as well for your efforts on this. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as white, Latinx, LGBTQ plus female. In terms of what I bring to the table, I currently sit on the school committee. I was caucused in July. In terms of professional background, I've been a civil rights attorney for over 20 years. I transitioned to nonprofit management, ran an affordable housing organization, as well as Greater Boston PFLAG, which is an LGBTQ plus advocacy organization, and currently run a program with a $50 million budget that works with disabled adults and elders. I am going to be chairing our DEIJ subcommittee, as Stephen mentioned. Our first meeting is on May 16th, and I invite everyone in attendance to attend that meeting if you have any interest. In terms of that background, I'm also first generation, so we seem to have a lot of first generation folks on the school committee, and that really impacted how I come to the school committee. I grew up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is also a particularly low socioeconomic community, and had many ethnic and racial disparities in our outcomes and our outputs, and look forward to another year in the school committee, working with our new superintendent and our equity director and team to really look for some data-driven approaches to make sure that our students are really getting what they need as we are really in this most dire year of the pandemic in many ways in terms of mental health.
Thanks, Valerie. And lastly, we have Nancy.
Hi, everybody. Again, thank you to Bridge. My name is Nancy Rigor. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as Korean American. I grew up in New Jersey. We were the only Asian family in maybe the town and certainly our school. And so I understand we were the only Korean family so I certainly understand what it feels like to be a minority in a school that was actually very diverse. I've been bullied as when I was a child, I was bullied by white, black, and brown people. And that was not fun. I am married to, my husband is Caucasian and my son is Asian, is biracial. We have lived in Brookline for 14 years or so, and I'm a mom and a retired mom, and we are at the Runkle School. By the way, public speaking is not my strength, so forgive me if I ramble or if I stutter. Racism is something I've lived with my entire life. Racism is something that I've had to learn to get along and kind of blend. So when we came to Brookline, we were very excited that Brookline was a very reportedly racially diverse town, and it didn't really feel that way right away when we moved here. I'm looking forward to being on the school committee and trying to help to fix some of the situations. And I think that we can get started with communication. I think that we need to start talking to each other. And I'm about to run out of time. Thank you.
Nancy, the order of responses for our first question will be Nancy, Val, Stephen, and Helen. How do your racial and ethnic identities influence and affect your work for racial justice? What are your blind spots and how will you be holding yourself accountable? And I'll put that in the chat.
It's a great question. My racial experiences, I grew up the only Korean family and in a very diverse town in New Jersey. It's difficult because I know what it's like to be an outsider. I know what it's like to be an outsider in Brookline. I think that we have a lot of work to do. I think that Brookline takes it on the chin often for some of the racist incidents, but I see at least in the last 2 years, that Brookline is trying. I mean, we've made some really good strides, and I'd like to talk about that when I'm on school committee. I want to understand, when something happens, like what happened at the high school, I want to understand why that happened. I'd like us to start talking to each other again as a community. I think that we're very siloed. And so, especially from a racial perspective, there are some people who feel like, Brookline is made up of racists, anti-racists, and everybody else in the middle. And I need to understand that. How did that happen? I think that some of the racism is very sort of deeply ingrained in Brookline. And I think that we need to get to the bottom of that. And I think that we can, as long as we have to just start talking to each other. And that's what I want to try to help with. My background is in communication, and I want to try to use that for all of us to start talking to each other.
So,
Sure. In terms of my experience and my work on racial justice, I saw my family, particularly my grandparents, discriminated against on a daily basis. Macroaggressions, microaggressions, and employment, in housing, in education, and in all areas. It was my family's lived experience. And in terms of what I wanted to do from a young age, it was really to be an advocate for folks. And that was what led me to law school, and that has that's led my justice work from my teen years onward. Really was some pretty direct experience in my family, as well as my own experience as an LGBTQ plus person and a Latinx person in a very and how that intersectionality impacted me in my own life. In terms of blind spots, I am very light skinned, and I have lots of privilege that I know that comes with that, and so sometimes I can I can miss things because because of my light skin, and I really need to be mindful of that as I walk through the world, because if I walk through the world with some of my cousins, things are very different than if I walk through the world by myself. And I need to just make sure that I'm watching for those microaggressions. And in terms of holding myself accountable, certainly through the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice Subcommittee, we're going to be doing that monthly as a school committee. But in my personal, I'm running out of time. That's a long one. I'm sorry, I had a lot more to say.
Shall I go? Okay, thanks for the question. And also, I just want to say thanks to Bridge again. This is a great chance to talk, but also to learn more about my colleagues. I'm a white man. I grew up in New York City, but I grew up in the Upper West Side of New York City, just as it was becoming the Upper West Side. But I grew up hearing stories about Nazis and the Holocaust for my entire childhood. So I grew up with a sense that there was a great deal that was wrong in the world. There was a great deal of evil. And I think that led me to seek out as a professional conflict and post-conflict environments where I'm most comfortable working. Most of my professional life in international education has been spent rebuilding school systems in Rwanda and Afghanistan in particular. And in the programmatic work I do, I gravitate towards trying to empower or otherwise support populations that are otherwise marginalized. I think my blind spot is that I'm a white man, and so I have all the privilege that a white man gets. And to mitigate that, I have to pledge constantly to listen and to center voices of color in conversations, not just in anti-racist conversations, but in all conversations. But I also can't just be passive. I need to be aware of how I can use my voice as a white man to bring along potential but nervous allies. I've been working professionally with DEI consultants recently, not just to review the program that I direct, but also to review how to create a more inclusive environment, but also to advocate to donors, to clients, and to other supporters who are nervous about anti-racist discourse to support the values of anti-racism. On accountability, I pledge to continue to listen, to attend forums like these, and to maintain anti-racist work as a top priority for myself. Thanks.
Shall I go? Okay. Well, I think, as I said before, being the first in my family, I think is something that has really, the first in my family to go to college, has really shaped me in many ways in terms of what that's like for families. I think I've been the STEPS liaison for the last, from the school committee for the last, I was a supporter from the beginning, but I've been the actual liaison to Steps to Success for the last 6 years. And I can really identify with how difficult it is when you're a student and your parents have no idea about applications to college, have no idea about how you go about even doing it. And I think that's why I've been so involved with STEPS and interested in the work that we do there. I think it's critically important. I guess another space where maybe many of you don't even remember, Brookline used to have a Head Start. And for years, it was housed in the High Street apartments in the basement. And it was an okay Head Start. It wasn't particularly great, but it was there and it really served families there. And then in the summer, probably 6 weeks before school was to begin, Head Start decided to move to Watertown. And all the families there were stuck with either they take a bus, have the bus that takes them over to Watertown, or what do we do? And Brookline really stepped up at that time, BEEP did. And we worked with the Department of Early Education and Care to make sure that our families were taken care of. These are the sorts of things that I've done on the school committee. in terms of what I see as racial justice and helping families to access. I guess that's it.
Thank you, Helen. The order of responses for our second question will be Val, Nancy, Helen, and Stephen. The 2021 MCAS data revealed that 78% of white Brookline students in grades 3 through 8 met or exceeded expectations on the English language arts test, compared to 32% of Black students. The gap for the math MCAS test was slightly higher, as 68% of white students and 17% of Black students met or exceeded expectations. We also know that standardized tests such as MCAS are limited in measuring student success and uphold structural racism. How do you make sense of and understand these test scores? What are the root causes of these disparate outcomes in Brookline? What measures would close the opportunity gap between our Black and white students? And I'll make sure to put that big question into the chat, and over to you, Val.
I'm going to try and get as much of this question in, Amy, as I can. So the disparate, sorry, I want to make sure that I'm seeing it all in the chat. The disparate numbers were certainly horrific. I think we all spoke about those at the particular school committee where they were presented to us, but sadly not surprising. We have lots and lots of work to do in terms of our structural and our institutional racism, and we need to start that anti-racist work much earlier. We need to have programs that are success models like the calculus project start at much lower grades with things like math. I am also not a particular proponent of the MCAS. I do believe that it bakes racist bias into it, but additionally, it takes away from teachers' ability to differentiate learning, because we spend a lot of time on focusing on that particular measure instead of working with all of our diverse learners in all of their diversity. And the other thing that those scores showed was that, you know, it was really complex, because if you did an overlay of, say, disabled and BIPOC, those numbers were even more horrific and more stark. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing that. And both Leslie Ryan Miller, our OTL director, and Janae Utaro did a presentation on what the district intends to do. And as a school committee member, I'm certainly going to be giving that lots and lots of oversight as we go through this next year. But we have tons of work to do, and we need to start that at much lower grades. I'm going to run out of time yet again. Apologies.
Thank you, Val. Next up is Nancy.
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the data, so forgive me. I too am not a huge fan of standardized tests, and I too am not surprised that the data turned out the way that it did. I think once I'm on school committee, I'd like to get to, well, so to answer the question, I think that I also like to know what the history of when, and is it a downward slope on what those numbers looked like? Has there been a pattern? Was it good and did it get bad? I'd like to know, I also want to know what the teachers thought of that. Did the teachers have an opinion as to why the scores were the scores that they were? I too think that we have a lot of work to do, especially in just identifying how we can appropriately measure how our different students are being educated. Is it the way that we're teaching the kids? Yes, there's inherent racism in the curriculum. I'm not going to argue that. But is there, are there impediments to learning at home? And how can we help with things like that? Again, I think we need to come together as a community, understand some of these problems at a very base level, and then try to work together as a community to try to answer some of these questions. It's a big question. Are there alternatives to MCAS that are more appropriately measure or the education that our kids are getting? Because just teaching to the test is not helping anybody. So I think those are I'm going to run out of time. I think those are some of the things that I'd like to address when I'm on school committee. Thanks.
Thanks, Nancy. Helen?
I'll try and not go over this time. So I think the 2021 MCAS data shows us what happened during the pandemic and the loss of learning that happened during that time, especially for low income and BIPOC kids. I think that we have had a varied history over the years on MCAS scores. There have been times when they've been better and times when they've been worse. I am not a fan of MCAS being a gateway to graduation. However, I think it does tell us some things if we look in the general piece as to where we need to put our efforts. I don't think it's the be all and end all, and I'm quite sure that Brookline teachers do not teach to the test. You know, if they are teaching well, kids should be able to pass the test. That's sort of the way I look at it. And they shouldn't have to teach to the test. That being said, I think there are a number of avenues that we need to take. And one, I think, of the most successful that's been shown over the years for low income and BIPOC children is to have early childhood education. And I'm hopeful that in the next 3 or 4 years, 4-year-olds will be part of the Brookline public school system. I think that's the only way that we can start to make up for some of the deficits that kids have coming into school. And that's where we start. I know that STEPS is now moving down to kindergarten. I think that's really important. You know, they got the grant from ARPA. And I think that we need to concentrate on 3 and 4-year-olds, as we do with the parent-child home program that starts actually at birth to 2 years. And I'll stop now before I get
Thanks, Helen. And over to you, Stephen.
Thanks for this question. Can you hear me? I'm sorry, my browser just crashed. Okay. The MCAS, the disparity on MCAS is outrageous. It is trending in the wrong direction, Nancy. And I'm going to say, Amy, that it's actually and Kimberly, it's even worse than that. If you look at Stanford's Education Opportunity Project data, it shows that Brookline is trending not only worse, but worse than its neighbors. It's going in the wrong direction. It's going in the wrong direction compared to what it should be doing for a community like ours and compared to communities around ours. It's outrageous. The cause of this is structural racism. It's the structural racism that's causing racial achievement gaps nationally and causing it in Brookline. The answer to the question of well, that's how I make sense of and understand these test scores. And it's incumbent upon us to implement a portfolio of activities that aim to undo that structural racism. As my colleagues have said, a lot of this burden is falling on the Office of Educational Equity under the direction of Janae Utaro. But it's not just Janae. Like, Janae's work is going to have to be to start to encourage and support and plant a more anti-racist culture in each of our school buildings, but it's also a review of the curriculum. It's also better efforts at teacher recruitment and retention so that students feel more comfortable and represented by with and by their teachers. It's greater support for students of color themselves, not just through affinity groups, but through more active interventions that help to understand what their lived experiences are, and look not just to the research, but to our own colleagues for practices that could mitigate some of their discomfort. I just had another thought in my head that I wanted to get out, and it's gone. I guess my short answer is that, yes, MCAS is a very flawed diagnostic, but the trend lines are in the wrong direction. It points to a real problem, and we need to be addressing it. Oh, the last thing I wanted to say was the key element to addressing this is a very indirect one, and that's stability and leadership in the public schools of Brookline. We can't make any change or hold anybody accountable if we run through a 6th school superintendent in this year. We've run through 5 in the past 5 years. We need to be actively supportive of the superintendent, which is why I strongly believe that it needs to be Superintendent Guillory's administration that's empowered and equipped to tackle these issues. It's not just the school committee making our profound statements in forums like these. It's also our active support to make sure that he's staffed up to deal with these problems. Thanks.
The order of responses for our third question will be Stephen, Helen, Nancy, and Val. A diverse educator workforce positively impacts all of our children. Students and educators of color in Brookline have demanded a more diverse educator workforce for many, many years. Once elected to the school committee, what is your plan to recruit, train, hire, and retain BIPOC teachers, guidance counselors, and staff? Stephen.
Thanks, Kimberly. So I've had the privilege for the past year of being the informal liaison to the Brookline Educators Committee for Educational Diversity. That's a group of teachers that are stipended to work with our Office of Educational Equity to identify and execute strategies for improving teacher recruitment and retention. This has been eye-opening, and it's really been an opportunity for me to see people coming up with their best practical suggestions. So I've seen events held to attract potential candidates of color. I've seen events to reach out to historically Black colleges and universities. There are a number of activities and events like this. However, we have a problem right now with teacher morale, and that is going to make it hard to be competitive in attracting new recruits to the district. So we are fighting on 2 fronts. One is we're trying to make sure that groups like BEAD are sufficiently resourced and empowered to execute these activities. And on the second hand, we have to make sure that our public schools of Brookline are sufficiently hospitable to new teachers, let alone new teachers of color, for them to stay. So that's where I'll end there.
So I think, one of the things that people should One of the things that people should understand is that the school committee does not hire teachers. We do hire the superintendent. We do hire the deputy superintendents, but that's it. We do provide resources for things that we feel that are important, such as Stephen was talking about, the group that Stephen was talking about. I think that by our actions of our last few hires, one can see where our thoughts are in terms of the superintendent. I was the chair of the committee that hired the superintendent. I think what probably helped to bring him to Brookline was the committee that interviewed him, the community committee, which was probably the most diverse committee I've ever been on. And they were actually picked for the first superintendent search that was failed. And then I decided that we needed to keep this committee when I was chair, because it was such a diverse and well-functioning group. It had a METCO representative, it had a teachers representative, parents representative, but from all ethnic groups. And I think, by having a diverse senior staff, which we are in charge of, that sort of sets the way that people look forward. Our HR director is a Black woman, and I think that she's initiated a number of things. These are the sorts of things that we can help with. We can't hire teachers, but we can make things so that people are able to do their work and hire the best people of color that we can find. So thank you.
I would like to echo what both Stephen and Helen said. I think that we do have a morale problem. I think that is probably something that we need to pay attention to right away, or some of the very gifted teachers that we have, especially some of the gifted teachers that we have of color are going to leave. And Helen, I think that the committee that you just discussed, I'd like to say that that committee worked very well because they spoke, because they worked together. And it was you know, again, I hate to keep punching this, but we have to start talking to each other. We have to communicate with each other. We have to figure out what's working and what's not, particularly in this instance. I happen to think our administration is doing a fantastic job. They are, for the first time in a long time, I have faith in central administration. I think Janae Utaro is, and Leslie Ryan Miller and Dr. Giller, and they're really, really, really strong. And we as school committee, it's our job to support them. I think that it's also what we can do as school committee members, isn't something I would like to do more of, is to listen to teachers, to listen to our teachers of color, to listen to all of our teachers, and find out what they think would work. Because we can talk to each other all day, but if we're not talking to people in the field, I think that we're just talking to ourselves. And I think that I'd like to sort of help to figure out a way to open up channels of communication, so that we all can start talking to each other and make this work better. That's it.
Okay, I'm really going to try to stick to my 2 minutes this time. So I think that what nobody has said so far, but it's a little bit of the elephant in the room, is our budget. Up until about a week or so ago, we had about a $3.5 million structural deficit for FY23, which meant that we had somewhere in the vicinity of 44 educators on the line for cuts. That was real. We were able to fill that FY23 gap with ARPA funding, but again, that's a structural cliff. And I think if we're looking either through BEAD and other ways at how we're recruiting, they're looking at that, and they're seeing how that's impacting our staff and our staff morale. And we really need to look at our long-term strategic planning and funding so that we can recruit, train, hire, and retain. And I want to talk a little bit about the culture of belonging. And I think that our central administration is really working on this in terms of that retention piece. We've spoken a lot about the recruitment, but I want to speak a little about the retention, because if teachers feel like they don't belong, then they're not going to stay. And again, the central administration has started groups at the high school, at Runkle, at Driscoll, and I believe one other elementary K-8 school for that kind of affinity group for our BIPOC teachers. And we can't have any more students coming to us over and over again saying that their first experience with a teacher of color is in high school. That's just unacceptable by all measures, and we really need to change that. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. And thank you all for sticking with our timer. The order of responses for our fourth question will be Val, Helen, Nancy, Stephen. And as was mentioned by some already in their opening statements, over a month ago now, the students from the African American and Latinx Scholars Program wrote a searing condemnation of how school administration has handled recent racist incidents, culminating in a student-led walkout at the high school. As students, staff, parents, and alumni have noted, this was not the first incident of racism, and there have already been reported incidents since. What are your plans to urgently address racist incidents when they happen in our school communities? How will you prevent incidents in the future? Please name tangible policies and practices to prevent future harm in our K-12 public school system. Val, over to you. And I will put the long question in the chat.
It's okay. I'm not going to be able to get through it all in 2 minutes, but I will start. So they have been horrific. They have been far too numerous, and the response has been inadequate for both the student population and the community at large, the caregiver community and the community at large. We at policy, so I sit on policy subcommittee, have been reviewing once again our anti-discrimination policies, as well as our code of conduct and related policies, so that we can really move toward a restorative justice model, which was put out in 2019 and then again was lost in administration transitions, as well as resource along with resource limitations. So we really need to bring that back. In terms of accountability, I know that the students, they came to our meeting and presented their bill that they have passing through their legislature. Administration has something similar that they are working on in terms of a communication feedback loop for what a level of disciplinary action that was taken. So I think that the administration and the students are working on similar responsive documents and plans, so that community understands, at least in the general ballpark, what that was. But I also, again, I think that the restorative justice piece is really then how we rebuild and integrate as a community from these incidents as they arise. And so again, it's part resource issues that we need to start, not just at the high school, but this starts in our K to 8s, and we really need to get that resourced, and we're going to need everyone in the community support for additional resources to make sure that we can do that starting at our K to 8s.
Thank you, Val. Helen?
Thank you. I agree very much with what Val has said up to now. I think that, there are policies that need to happen, but I think we also have to understand, that this is somewhat a reflection of what's happening in society in general, where you see the rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Black racism and anti-Asian racism. I think, so Brookline is a small microcosm of what's going on in the rest of the world. That being said, I do think that the restorative justice that we had started and we're working quite strongly with needs to be reinvigorated and really started up again. I also think that we have sort of slipped a little bit in our teaching in the and middle school, really, of facing history, which really works on using the Holocaust as an example, but how people can make people, the other, the perpetrators and the upstanders and bystanders, all that learning that happened or used to happen a great deal in middle school has not been done as much lately, or not as well. I think we have many new teachers in the middle schools, and I think they haven't been trained in it. And I think I have been pushing for it on the curriculum subcommittee as one way. It's not the only. I think the restorative justice is very important also. But I also think that the perpetrators are kids who are crying out in some ways for help. Acting out in ways that they know are inappropriate. In Brookline, you can't not know that this is, something that's wrong to do. So I think we need to understand everything in this, but it's certainly a very important issue.
Thank you, Helen. Nancy?
I think that when I found out what happened, I was horrified, and then I was heartbroken, because how did this happen? And what happened to this person to make them feel like this is something that they needed to do? And then I think how it was handled was not handled very well. So I think, to answer the question, we need a better plan. We need a better plan for when this happens. And the plan shouldn't be to pull out kids of color and ask them, what should we do? That should not have happened either. I think that we need some more training on what the policy should be across the board. I also don't know what happened to the student. I never really got a straight answer as to what happened to the student who did this. I think if the policies, we come up with a plan on how to deal with these things in a very clear way. We can't put it all on Janae. This has to be across the board, and maybe we ask our administrators at the school level how would they, how to do this. I think, and then once that plan is clear, I don't know if it's a zero tolerance policy or something that has to be that extreme, but I think that it needs to be sort of communicated very well that stuff like this is not going to be tolerated. And when it happens, that this will happen. When this happens, then this happens next. This is what happens to you. I think that those kinds of, again, and then there needs to be communication around that. Did we ask, did we ask what, like the families of everybody that this happened to, what happened? Again, public speaking is not my thing, so I'm very sorry. And I'm out of time. Sorry.
Thanks, Nancy. Stephen?
Thanks for this question. So I want to start by addressing this sentence. What are your plans to urgently address racist incidents when they happen in our school communities? There isn't a culture of urgency in PSB, in Brookline, when it comes to handling racist incidents. That's a problem. And compounding that, school committee members have to act in concert and in compliance with open meeting law. So it's not like we can talk quietly to make our plans and then propose them. We have to do this out loud in public, transparently, right away. So there are some structural bureaucratic factors that are holding us back. That said, there are some very specific actions that I think we can take. One, that are within our powers. One, I think we need to continue to press the superintendent and his designates at public school committee meetings for transparency on communications in the buildings where these incidents occur. Part of the problem is the act itself, but compounding that problem is communications about that. Nobody knows what happened. I mean, part of it is, but we can't disclose disciplinary actions, but we also can disclose a bit more about our protocol and processes. The second thing that we could do, I think the policy subcommittee is doing a fantastic job. I think Val's work on that committee has been great. I think David Perlman's chairmanship of that has been great. And I also think that we need more explicit anti-hate speech and iconography sub-policies within our anti-discrimination policy. That's well within our parameters for action. I think we can include explicit DEI and J evaluation criteria for a superintendent. We can't evaluate school building leaders, but we can evaluate our superintendent. We can include that criteria for him. And I think our DEI and J subcommittee needs to include space for student voice so we can hear directly from students. One more recommendation, I'm going to cram this in. I think we also need to offer professional development to support teachers to facilitate discussion after hate incidents. I've heard varying reports on the existing capacity within our faculty. Some are amazing at it and some are untrained at it. We need to make sure everyone can facilitate this conversation after an incident. Thank you.
Order of response for our fifth question will be Nancy, Stephen, Val, and then Helen. For the past 3 years, BRJE has advocated for reinstating the ACE guidance position from half-time to full-time, which we see as a racial justice issue. The percentage of ACE students who were accepted into four-year colleges in 2018 were 93%, but dropped to 57% in 2021, in 2 years after the reduction of the guidance counselor position. The drop in the rate of college attendance was even more dramatic in 2018. 93% attended four-year colleges, while in 2021, only 31% attended. ACE students include some of our district's most historically marginalized student population, including BIPOC, first generation, and low income. Do you share our belief that it is important to reinstate the position? And if so, how will you prioritize making the ACE position whole once you are elected to the school committee? Nancy?
I'd like to ask our administrators why they think that is a dramatic drop. That is considerable and dramatic drop. I'd like to begin by asking our administrators what happened. Have we asked some of the students who didn't attend what happened and what influenced their decision not to attend. I want to know what advisement they were offered, what advisement services they were offered or not offered, as to what, and find out what happened there, before I can sort of answer this question fully as to whether or not, where are we falling down? I want to find out where the pitfalls are, specifically as to where we're falling down and why these numbers are dipping so dramatically. Regarding if we do find a deficit and we actually do find that the solution, the appropriate solution, and it seems obvious, is by filling that position, then yeah, we absolutely should. But with a lack of information, and I'm sorry, I don't have the background that my esteemed colleagues do, I feel like I might not be the best person to answer this question. That's it.
Stephen?
Thanks. Yes, I support this position being full-time. Just when I first learned about this from So-Young Kim, who I see is online right now, and who incidentally submitted a really evidence-packed letter describing the impact of having a full-time FTE in the ACE program. When I first heard about it, it seemed like a no-brainer. So I did some investigating, and then there was a public discussion about the ACE program in which, and I may be misrecalling, but I believe that someone from BHS referred to the student-teacher ratio as being the rationale for cutting that position and having to balance a lot of other cuts as well. So, and I remember thinking that that was a legitimate rationale, but it didn't consider the extent to which ACE has been a successfully anti-racist program. And we can't evaluate FTEs strictly on equitable student-teacher ratios. We also have to prioritize some programs that we think are best embodying and realizing core PSB values. One of them is respect for human differences. Another one of them is educational equity. It's pretty clear from student qualitative data, from anecdotes, from the quantitative data that So-Young put together, that ACE has been a very deeply impactful program. And the anti-racist case for having a full-time position at ACE seems very strong to me. And so I've supported it throughout. That said, that level of decision-making, I don't believe is best left to the school committee. I believe it's best left to the superintendent and his designates at the building level to determine what's the appropriate levels of staffing for different programs. Thanks.
So my answer to your first part is yes, absolutely, hands down. And I have been advocating for it for this budget cycle and advocated for it before. I was on school committee in prior cycles. And I think that the issue has been that it isn't exactly a student to teacher ratio, it's guidance counselor to student ratio. And they're looking at it in a way that is equal but not equitable, right? So equality, we know that equality and equity aren't the same thing, and the outcomes that have been shown by decreasing that position in terms of college, in terms of many other outcomes for those students have been so dire that I do believe that restoring it to a full FTE is both the educationally right thing to do, the morally right thing to do, and policy-wise, the right thing to do. I've advocated for that to our administration and for them to put into the budget detail, and we'll see where it lands this year. It was not placed in the budget pre-ARPA. I've made the request of the superintendent again to look at it once more when we were made whole. So we'll see as we move through town meeting how that budget process goes. But we will need input from everybody to advocate for that addition. Thank you.
you want me to start? Okay, I'll start. Forget about the timer. There we go. I actually was privileged to be able to sit in on a whole day of classes at ACE back, I'd say about 4 years ago, possibly, maybe 5. It's an excellent program. It really accomplishes what it needs to do with students who aren't necessarily on IEPs, but who need a different sort of education, just as some of our other programs do, whether it's school within a school or some other of the high school programs, Bright being one of them. But I think I guess I disagree with my colleagues here. I think we have to look at the totality. I think the going down of kids going to college, in my opinion, is probably more due to the pandemic than anything else. ACE has approximately 48 kids, or did, maybe 50, in the program. They have a full-time director and a half-time social guidance counselor, whereas SWS has 150 kids and has one director who is the guidance counselor for all the kids. And we have to look at proportionality here. Steps to Success, for instance, had the same sort of, they had much better college attendance in the years pre-pandemic. And since the pandemic, the kids going on to college has been much less. I think that we as a school committee need to look at the entire system and see what makes sense and what is appropriate in terms of numbers and ratios. So at this point, to answer your question, I would not support bringing the guidance counselor to full-time.
Thank you, Helen. And that ends the question and answer period, but we'd like to give our candidates an opportunity to make a final statement. Final statement should be 2 minutes or shorter, and the order will be Helen, Val, Stephen, then Nancy.
So I'm just going to finish from the last piece. I would support it if it were a program that had 100 to 150 kids, because then you do have kids who really, one half-time social work guidance counselor would not be enough. So that's in terms of ACE. I appreciate you guys really doing this forum. I think it's important. I remember coming last time 3 years ago, and I think it's, the questions have gotten even more incisive and better. I guess, I'm not even sure what else at this point. You've asked so many different questions that at this point, I think we've sort of gotten everything out that needed to be said. I do think that, we can always do better in Brookline in terms of racial justice. And I think we have to always keep our eye on the prize of, making sure that we have a system that we can be proud of in many respects, whether it be in student achievement, whether it be in anti-racist, social justice issues, in all aspects of an excellent education for all students. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Val?
Thank you for hosting this forum. It raised a number of great questions for us to begin conversation with in this community, and I welcome another forum in between cycles. I would love to have more forums where we focus on specific topics, because I think there's so much to each of those 2-minute questions that that we could really have a deeper conversation about. In terms of of priorities for this year, it really, from my perspective as a school committee member, is to support this administration to make sure that we are data-driven in our approaches to all of those gaps, those opportunity gaps that we discussed earlier. We need to make sure that we're elevating that conversation and keeping our superintendent accountable at all of our meetings. We need to center those student voices. They are speaking to us loud and clear. And again, we need to make sure that the administration is accountable to the superintendent, who's accountable to us at the building level, all the way up to the school committee. I want to make sure that some of those questions that you asked Mike Sandman are also, they relate to education in terms of affordable housing and basic needs and all of those things that our students need in order to come into their school in the most prepared way possible. And so we really need to collaborate with our community partners on making sure that we're addressing what I call the social determinants of learning, to make sure that our students who are disproportionately impacted, our BIPOC, our SES, and and other marginalized communities are really supported in a way that brings them to their desk in the same way as their other Brookline peers. Thank you.
Thank you, Val. Stephen?
Thanks, Amy. First, I want to thank Bridge for this opportunity. I always find this forum to be one of the most rigorous. Not that the questions are super hard, but you guys clearly prepare pretty deeply for this, and it's reflected in your questions. So thanks for the seriousness that you take this forum with. I just want to say two things in my final comments. One is I want to urge you all to attend the DEI and J subcommittee and to make public comment. I think this is a great opportunity right now for you to keep public pressure up on the school committee. I think we're listening and we're responsive. I think under Val's leadership, I think Val has already done a tremendous amount of homework for this committee to make sure that it's going to be genuinely inclusive. I think it's going to do a lot to raise the visibility of ongoing initiatives in the district. It's going to make them a lot more transparent, and it's going to include measures of accountability for our anti-racist work. I think, in short, that this is a mechanism that the school committee can really get behind to make change, and to make sure that that change is visible, transparent, and accountable according to specific metrics. The other comment I want to make is, I know from listening to the student protests and listening to students talk that some of them have gone through their entire Brookline education, or maybe just their Brookline high school education, but for some their entire education not seeing change. And that's really disillusioning. And I just want to say to this community, I hope you don't get cynical, because I think the current makeup of the school committee is genuinely committed to anti-racist work. And where we fall down, it's not for a lack of will, but maybe for a lack of knowledge about good or best practices. So I just want to conclude by urging Bridge's ongoing engagement with the school committee through the subcommittee, through public comment, and through all other channels. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And last, Nancy?
So I too wanted to thank Bridge for this forum. I think that the work that you're doing is very, very important. I think that racial inequity and racism in Brookline is still very real. I think that and forums and organizations like this and forums like this really help us to think. And it's important for us to think, because it's easy to just keep going and to not ever take a moment to think about what's happening. I think I also want to say that I want to echo what Steve said in my own way and say that I have hope. I think that this school committee is in a really, really, really good shape, and I'm proud and honored to be a part of it starting this year. I think that we can accomplish a lot, and I want to say what Stephen said is, please don't lose hope, because I'm hopeful too. I want to bring that hope, and I really want to start bringing that hope back to the kids and the teachers, because I think that we have a lot of really good things that we've begun, and I think I want to see those good things have traction, and I want everyone to know just how much everyone is doing, everything that everyone is doing. Sorry, and I just wanted to say that just keep the faith, because this school committee and this administration really is committed to doing some very, very good work. Thank you.
you, Nancy, and thank you to our school committee candidates, Helen, Val, Stephen, and Nancy for your responses, and to our candidates who joined us tonight for your participation in our forum, and to all of you for joining this evening. Remember our town election is tomorrow, Tuesday, May 3rd. Polls are open from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. And for more information on polling location, please visit brookline.gov. Although these are largely uncontested races, our candidates' positions on racial justice matter now more than ever. Having heard their vision and ideals tonight, we hope everyone will hold our candidates accountable. This election is also unusually important because most every seat in town meeting is on the ballot. Our re-precincting process, the 17th precinct, and created a need to reallocate town meeting seats in 16 of those precincts. With 15 seats of each precinct this year, there are 359 people running for 245 town meeting open seats. This re-precincting, I hate that word, the redistricting effort established 2 majority-minority precincts in precincts 2 and in precincts 4. Please keep in mind the importance of representation when you vote, especially in these 2 precincts. Please show up to vote tomorrow, and thank you again for all coming, and have a great night.